Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to another Salucci production. We are reading part 3 about Louis. At this point, Louis is done with the Olympics. He is raring to go for the next Olympics. We don't know when that's going to be because supposedly in 1940, the Olympics were supposed to be in Tokyo, Japan. However,
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
So because of that, we all know that World War II, with the United States getting included, is going to start. Now, Louis has joined the Air Force, and his brother joins the Army. And his main goal is to fly B-52s in search and rescue missions for those planes that went down or those planes that got shot down. That's his main job. But he's still running to kind of make that Olympic team in case the war ends. Nobody's going to live through this. Chapter 11. On Thursday, May 27th, 1943, 2 years after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Louis rose at 5 a.m. He pulled on his workout clothes, hiked to the runway, and began his morning mile run. 4 minutes and 12 seconds later, he finished. 4 minutes and 12 seconds. It was a dazzling time, given that he was running in sand. He was in the best shape of his life. After breakfast, he climbed into a car with Phil and Cuppernell. Now, this guy, Phil, is his best friend. It's kind of like P. Diddy and Notorious B.I.G. They're the buds. Babe. See what I'm saying? So, that's the deal with him and Phil. Now, at the base gate, back to reading, the despised lieutenant who oversaw their flight flags them down. A B-24 piloted by a Tennessee named Clarence Corpening was missing. That's him over there on the right side. He's young. And they needed volunteers to hunt for him. Phil told him that they had no plane. The lieutenant said they could take the Green Hornet. When Phil said the plane wasn't airworthy, the lieutenant disagreed, saying it had passed inspection. Phil knew that though the word volunteer was being used, this was an order. He volunteered. The lieutenant will pilot Joe Daisy and has recruited his team as well. And they take the B-24 Daisy May. So there's 2 planes going out. Phil, Louis, and Cuppernell turned back to round up the crew. Stopping at his room, Louis opened his diary. There was only one ship, the Green Hornet, he wrote. We're very, very reluctant but Phillips finally gave in for the rescue mission. They don't want to take this plane. Just before he left, Louis laid a note on his front footlocker in which he kept his liquor hidden in many mayonnaise jars. Yeah. If we're not back in a week, it read, help yourself to the booze. There's his diary. Meeting the crews at Green Hornet, the lieutenant unrolled a map. He believed Corpening had gone down 200 miles north of Palmyra, an island several hours south of Hawaii. He assigned each crew to search the area. Green Hornet being loaded for its final flight. That's the one up top right there. Preparing for takeoff, everyone worried about the Green Hornet. Without heavy bombs aboard, Louis told himself the plane should be able to stay airborne. Phil was concerned that the mechanics had removed parts from the plane. He hoped nothing critical was missing, like a liver. The crew reviewed crash procedures and checked survival equipment. There was a provision box containing food, water, and survival piles. The responsibility of the new tail gunner, Mac, not my dog Mac. You might hear him in the background though. Louis made sure the extra life raft was there. He put on his Mae West. Phil left his off. A Mae West is a life preserver, basically. At the last moment, a man ran up and asked for a ride to Palmyra. There was no objection, and the man climbed aboard. Daisy May and Green Hornet flew together toward Palmyra. Green Hornet couldn't keep up. After about 200 miles, Phil radioed to Daisy to go on ahead. The planes parted, and the crews lost sight of each other. Mid-afternoon, Green Hornet reached its search area. Because of clouds, no one could see the water. Phil dropped the plane under the clouds to just 800 feet. Louis stood just behind Phil and Cuppernell, scanning the ocean. Next page. Cuppernell asked if he could switch seats with Phil. Phil agreed. The enormous Cuppernell squeezed around Phil and onto the left seat as Phil moved to the right. A few minutes later, there was a shudder. Louis looked out the window. Engine number 1 on the far left was shaking violently. Then it died. The bomber tipped left and began dropping rapidly toward the ocean. It was a dire emergency. Because Green Hornet was already very low, Phil and Cuppernell had only seconds to save the plane. They began working rapidly. To minimize drag from the broken engine, they needed to feather it. Turn the dead propeller blades parallel to the wind and stop the rotation. Normally this was Cuppernell's job, but now he was the pilot in the pilot seat, busy trying to keep the plane up airborne. He shouted to the new engineer to come feather the engine. The new engineer ran forward. There were 4 feathering buttons. 4. 1 for each engine. Leaning towards Cuppernell and Phil, the engineer banged on the button. Green Hornet heaved and lurched left. The engineer had hit the wrong button. Who hits the wrong button? There's only 4. Sorry. Both leftward engines were now dead. Oh no. Phil pushed the 2 working engines full on, trying to keep the plane up long enough to start the good left engine. The racing right engines rolled the plane halfway onto its left side, sending it into a spiral. The engine wouldn't start. The plane kept dropping. Green Hornet was doomed. Phil grunted 3 words. Prepare to crash! Louis ran from that flight deck, yelling for everyone to get to crash position. As the plane whirled, he grabbed the extra life raft and clambered toward his crash position by the right waist window. He saw Mac clutching the provisions box. Other men were frantically pulling on Mae West, which is their life preservers. But Mitchell didn't emerge from the nose. As a navigator, it was his duty to gather navigation instruments for use on the life raft and relay the plane's position to the radio man so he could send a distress signal. But with the plane gyrating down nose first and the escape passage narrow, perhaps Mitchell couldn't get out. As the men behind the cockpit fled toward the comparative safety of the rear, one man, almost certainly the engineer who'd hit the wrong feathering button, apparently stayed in front. It was his duty to pull the raft release handle behind the cockpit to ensure that the raft would be near survivors. He would have to wait until the instant before the crash to pull the handle. This meant, he had no chance to get to the crash position and thus little chance of survival. You don't want that job, kids. Phil and Cuppernell fought the plane. Green Hornet rolled onto his left side, moving faster and faster as the right engine stuttered. Phil, strangely fearless, he watched the ocean rotating up at him and thought, there's nothing more I can do. Louis sat on the floor by the right waist window. There was 5 men near him. No one said anything. Louis looked out the window. All he saw was the cloudy sky turning around and around. Sensing the ocean coming up at the plane, he took a last glance at the twisting sky, then pulled the life raft in front of him and pushed his head into his chest. One terrible tumbling second passed, then another. An instant before the plane struck the water. Louis' mind throbbed with a single final thought. Nobody is going to live through this. For Louis, there was jagged, soundless sensations. His body catapulted forward, the plane breaking open, something wrapping around his waist. Around him, the cold slap of water, and then its weight all over him. Next page. Green Hornet stabbed into the ocean and blew apart. Louis felt himself being pulled deep underwater. Then abruptly the downward motion stopped and Louis was flung upward, the fuselage momentarily buoyed by the air trapped inside. Leapt to the surface, Louis opened his mouth and gasped. The air hissed from the plane and the water rushed up over Louis again. The plane slipped under the sank under the ocean floor. It's like the Titanic. Louis tried to orientate himself. The tail was no longer behind him, the wings no longer ahead. The men who'd been around him were gone. Oh my God, they're gone. The impact had rammed Louis into a machine gun mount and wedged him under it. Face down, countless wires were coiled around his body, binding him to the gun mount. He looked at them and thought, spaghetti. He thrashed usually against them. He felt frantic to breathe. In the cockpit, Phil was fighting to get out. When the plane hit, he was thrown forward, his head striking something. A wall of water punched through the cockpit, and the plane carried him under. From the darkness, he knew he was far below the surface, sinking deeper by the second. He apparently saw a copper mill squeeze his big body off the plane. Really? Phil found what he thought was the cockpit window frame, its glass missing. He pushed himself through and swam toward the surface. He emerged in a puzzle of debris, his head gushing blood. He found a hunk of wreckage and clung to it. He began to sink. There were 2 empty life rafts far away. Carpenter was nowhere to be found or seen. Far below, Louis was writhing in the wires. Oh, Louis. He saw a body drifting passively. The plane coursed down, and the world fled all the way above. Darkness enfolded him, and the water pressure bore in with greater and greater intensity. He struggled helplessly. He thought, hopeless. It's only the next chapter. He can't die yet, kids. He felt a sudden excruciating bolt of pain in his head. There was an oncoming stupor as he tore out the wires and clenched his throat against the need to breathe. With a soft realization that this was the last of his life, he passed out. He woke in total darkness. He thought, this is death. Then he felt the water still on him, the weight of the plane around him. Inexplicably, the wires were gone. Whoa. He was floating inside the fuselage which was bearing him downward. The air was gone from his lungs, and he was gulping reflexively, swallowing water. That is the worst feeling, if you know what I mean. He tasted oil, fuel, and blood. He was drowning. Louis flung out his arms, trying to find a way out. His right hand struck something, and his college ring snagged on it. His hand was caught. He reached toward it with his left hand and felt a smooth length of metal. It was the opening right waist window. He put his feet on the frame and pushed off, wrenching his right hand free and cutting his finger and scraping his back on the fuselage. He kicked clear. The plane sank away. Louis yanked the inflation cords on his Mae West, which is his life preserver. He was suddenly light, the vest pulling him urgently upward. He burst into dazzling daylight. He gasped in breath and immediately vomited up the salt water. I'm not going to vomit salt water, kids. And the fuel he'd swallow. He had survived. Thank God. This was a Salucci production.